Well, hello, church. It's time for our Wednesday night lesson. I appreciate you watching. And as many of you have heard, we do have plans to resume our worship services. As of yet, we do not have our plans in place about when we will start Sunday night and Wednesday night services. But Sunday morning, unless the coronavirus rears its ugly head again, we're going to plan on starting to meet on May the 17th. We're following some of the medical guidelines that are recommended by our government. And in so doing, we will be opening up services around phase 2 for Oklahoma. Phase 1 begins in the first of the month of May, and we want to be safe. We also want to let everyone know that if you do not feel safe in coming, we're not going to judge you for staying at home, especially our older members. We want you to stay safe because you are the most vulnerable people as far as this disease goes. We're going to continue our study on David. This is going to be our next to last lesson on David before we move on to another topic. And in this lesson, David has finished the war against Absalom, the civil war that Absalom started. And now it's time for him to take the throne back. And this is going to be covering chapters 19 of 2 Samuel through chapter 23. Now, the good thing about these lessons is that if you want to pause me at any time, you can. And you can read the passages I'm referring to because I'm not going to read them out loud while I'm doing this lesson. And if you get bored, I guess you can fast forward me. But if you're doing that, enjoy it while you can because that's not going to last. At any rate, the other tribes of Israel, mainly the 10 tribes, other than Judah and Benjamin, are the very first to start talking about bringing David back into the kingdom to set him back on the throne. David sends a priest to the people of Judah with a message asking them why they are waiting so long to delaying and bringing back their own person from their own tribe back to the kingdom. Now, David, in this process, is going to encourage them to take part in all of this so that the whole nation moves together as one. He's also going to promise Amasa, who is David's nephew, to be the commander of the army. Now, Amasa had commanded the army under Absalom, but David's been wanting to get rid of Joab for some time, and he takes an advantage of this time to do that. Now, also by promising Amasa the job, David sends a very clear message. I'm not holding grudges. I'm not going to have ill will toward anyone. He's taking a former enemy and making him a partner in the kingdom. Now, David's going to meet a number of people as he begins to come back to Jerusalem, as he's about ready to cross the river. And one of those that is sent to David is Shimei. Shimei is the man who cursed at David, told him he got what he had coming, and he threw stones at David and his men and shouted curses, and Abishai wanted to kill him, and David wouldn't let him. But here we find Shimei, a Benjamite, leading 1,000 men, and they bring supplies to David, and they bring gifts to David, and Shimei brings a very, very frightened apology to David, and he's going to ask permission, or actually forgiveness from David. And Abishai still wants to kill him, but David will not let him. He said, don't I know that I'm king? I don't need to kill somebody to prove that I'm king. I don't need to reaffirm my kingship in that way. So David tells him he is going to let him live. Now, the next person to greet David was Mephibosheth. Now, when Mephibosheth appears, it's obvious that he has not cared for himself for quite some time. The writer tells us that Mephibosheth had not cared for his feet, he had not cut his mustache, he had not washed his clothes since the day David left the city until he returned safely. This was another form of fasting. There's not just fasting from food. The Apostle Paul will talk about fasting from sleep. But Mephibosheth is going to enter a period of mourning, and the mourning was over David's departure. And so it's obvious when you look at Mephibosheth that this has been going on for some time. Now, when David asked Mephibosheth, "Why didn't you come with me?" Mephibosheth will answer in chapter 19 that he was trying to get his donkey saddled up. He said, "But your servant is lame." And Ziba basically left without him. And Ziba lied about him, and Ziba defamed Mephibosheth to David. Mephibosheth is going on to go on to praise David and state that no matter what happens, no matter what David decides or does, Mephibosheth has no complaints. David took him at a time when Mephibosheth was helpless and hopeless, and he put him in David's house. He fed him from his table, and he made it very clear that he didn't deserve that honor, and he was putting himself at David's mercy. Now, David had previously listened to Ziba tell David that Mephibosheth acted like he thought he was going to get the kingdom back now. And so he slandered Mephibosheth to David, and David apparently believed him because he gave all of Mephibosheth's property to Ziba. But now, after hearing the side of Mephibosheth, he tells him he's going to split the property between the two of them. Mephibosheth is going to answer by saying, you can give it all to him. What matters the most to me is that you have come back safely. So he made it clear that David's safety meant more to him than any possessions at all. Now, that exchange between Mephibosheth and David seems to kind of reflect something that's going to happen later on, because it's going to affect Solomon's life, I believe. In Proverbs 18, verse 17, the writer tells us that it always seems like the first person you hear state his case seems to be right until you hear his neighbor. And in this case, David had listened to Ziba, thought his case sounded right. But then later on, he gets to hear the side of Mephibosheth, and he realizes there is a possibility that there are two sides to this story. There's another similarity between what happens here in Solomon's life when Solomon is faced with two women. Now, these women lived together. They both had children about the same time, and one of them during the night rolled over on her baby, killed the baby. Then during the night while the other slept, swapped babies. Now the woman who's got a dead baby in her bed realizes it's not her baby, and so they have to take this to court. They have to take it to Solomon to decide the case. So it's a she said case with this story. Solomon calls for a sword to divide the living child equally to give to each one of the women. Immediately, the real mother says, no, let her have the child. But the woman who had lost her baby kind of betrays her guilt as well as her grief when she said, no, kill the baby, it'll be neither hers nor mine. And Solomon said, give it to this woman who wanted to save it. He realized that she was the real mother, because she didn't really want to have the baby as much as she wanted the baby to live. Again, reflecting the attitude of Mephibosheth when he meets and greets David. The next person that is going to be mentioned is Barzillai the Gileadite. Now, Barzillai had accompanied David during his tough times, and now as they're getting ready to cross the river and go back to Jerusalem, David wants Barzillai to come back with him, but Barzillai said, no. I'm an old man. I'm 80 years old, and I'm just going to be a burden. What can I do? I can go to your house and I can eat your food, but that's about it. I want to go home. I want to go to my people, to my city, and I want to die in my home. And David gives him his blessings and tells him basically, anytime you need anything, all you have to do is ask. Now, in the latter part of chapter 19, in verses 40 to 43, there's an argument because the tribe of Judah takes the lead in bringing David and parading him back into the kingdom. And so they argue that wait a minute, we were the first ones that wanted to bring David back, and now you're kind of taking over. And the men of Judah said, well, he's our blood. He's our relative. It's only right that we would bring back our relative and take the lead. And they still argue, but the men of Judah refused to back down. As a matter of fact, neither one of them left this backing down. They went away with some hard feelings toward one another. And it seems like the seeds of division are planted at this time. The divided kingdom that became a fact under Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, seems to have begun here in 2 Samuel chapter 19, where the 10 tribes, and they're called the 10 northern tribes later on, are beginning to find fault with their brethren. Now in chapter 20, another revolt begins. This one is started by another Benjamite, Sheba, and David tells Amasa to get an army together. And he gives him 3 days to get the army together, but Amasa delays. We don't know why he delays. We don't know if it's intentional or just incidental. But at any rate, when he delays and David sees that everything's not ready, he makes mention to Abishai that Sheba's going to do us more harm than Absalom did, realizing that if I don't nip this rebellion in the very beginning, then the people are ripe to be misled again. So Abishai goes out and tells Joab. Joab and his men are going to pursue after Sheba, but first Joab takes care of something else. He goes up to talk to Amasa, acting like they're going to confer about strategies, and Amasa is not on guard, and Joab takes a knife and kills him and leaves him there on the ground, wallowing, still alive, but he's going to die. And then they pursue after Sheba and his men. Sheba flees into a city, and the city is shut up and apparently ready to defend him. And Joab's men are beginning to build a siege works against the city so they can conquer the city wall. And they are being very destructive about the way they go about building their siege works. Apparently they are taking anything they can that's around them, that's nearby, and they are not being careful about it. During this time, there's a very wise woman of this city, and she sends a message out. She said, I need to talk with Joab. Joab comes to talk to her, and they have kind of a private conversation, as private as possible under the circumstances. And she basically asks Joab, are you just intent on destroying a city? Are you intent on destroying innocent people, including an old woman in this city? And Joab said, no, we want Sheba. He's the one we want. She said, give me some time. And she goes and talks to the men of the city, and they decide that it's better for one man to die than for all of them. So they capture Sheba, they behead him, and then they throw his head over the wall, and Joab takes it and leaves, and the battle is ended. The woman saved her city. Chapter 21 begins with talking about a famine, and we don't know time-wise when this occurred in David's reign, because some of these things seem to be mentioned out of chronological order. But at any rate, there's a famine that takes place for 3 years, and David inquires of God why the people are suffering, why the land is suffering. Is it some sin they've done? What is it that's causing this? And the Lord makes it known to him that the reason there is a famine is because of something that King Saul had done while he was king. You see, during the days of Joshua, a lot of the people that were in the land of Canaan banded together to fight against Israel. But there's one city, a city named Gibeon, that decided they were going to lose. And so they got some men together and they made it look like they had come from a long distance, and they lied to Joshua and his men and told them they'd come from a long distance and wanted to make a covenant with Israel. Well, Joshua believed what he saw and did not talk to God, because God had told him to make no covenant with anyone in the land, and he and Israel made a covenant. Later they found out that the Gibeonites lived within the territory of the Promised Land. And they were very angry, but because of the covenant, the treaty, they could do nothing against the Gibeonites except make them forced laborers. And the Gibeonites said, hey, I'd rather be a live slave than a dead hero. But Saul, we're told, in his zeal for the sons of Israel, decided that he was going to go ahead and wipe out the Gibeonites totally. He may have reasoned that they had no right to be there in the first place, but he acted against the covenant that Israel had made with Gibeon, and God disapproved of this, and that's the reason for the famine. When David found this out, he sent for the men of Gibeon, and he asked them what it was going to take to satisfy their sense of justice. And they told him, we don't want Saul's silver or gold. We don't want his land. We really have no authority to kill anyone in Israel. In other words, they were telling David, we will only act as far as what you allow us to act. They had not really taken an active role in this from the beginning. It was God who brought this to David's attention, not the Gibeonites. And so David very wisely asks them, what's it going to take to have justice and to satisfy your sense of justice? And they said, well, the man who wanted to exterminate us from the land, give us 7 of his sons. And so David does. He spares Mephibosheth because of his vow with Jonathan. But he gives over the 7 sons to the Gibeonites, and they hang them. They hang them in Gibeah of Saul. In other words, in Saul's homeland. It's kind of a message to be telegraphed that sins will come back to you. Anyway, Rizpah was a concubine of Saul, and 2 of the 7 who were killed by the Gibeonites were her sons. Well, Rizpah camped out, and she watched over the dead bodies. And it was for a long time, from the harvest to the rain. And we're told that she kept the wild animals away, the birds away, and she just basically lived there next to the dead bodies. And David was touched by the story when he found out about it. He sent men to gather not only the bodies of those 7 men, but also to retrieve the bones of Jonathan and Saul from where they had been buried in Jabesh Gilead. And he brings all of them back, and all of them are interred in the grave of Kish, the father of King Saul. Now we're going to skip to chapter 21, verses 15. We're going to skip chapter 21, verses 15 through 22, because we covered those in a previous lesson about things that David had done, because frankly this is out of chronological order, and we needed that other passage for context. We're going to go to chapter 22, which we're pretty much going to skip as well, and I hope you don't mind. But chapter 22 is a song of praise that David will write to God, a very lengthy psalm, but in it David is showing his gratitude to God for his care. He's showing praise to God for his greatness. You might want to read at least one of the verses. Chapter 22, verse 4 is going to sound familiar to you, particularly if you read it in the King James Version. We sing a song that's based upon this verse. I shall call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. Now you might want to pause that and sing that song to yourself before we go on. But at any rate, that's an interesting thing, because many of the songs that we sing are based on Scripture, and we find them very often, especially in the Psalms. We're going to go to chapter 23. In chapter 23, verses 1 through 7 are reported to be the last words of King David, and they most likely are. But in it, again, David's going to praise God. And then what follows that are some basic stories about the mighty men of David. One of them is of particular note, tells about a battle in which David grows very weak and weary and thirsty, and he begins to think about home. And he said, oh, that I could drink from the well of the waters of Bethlehem that are near the gate. 3 of his mighty men break through the lines of the Philistines into the Philistine camp, and they draw water from that well and bring it back to David. David is surprised at what they've done, and he is humbled by it as well. And he said, "Far be it from me that I should drink the blood of the men who went out and risked their own lives for this water." So he pours the water on the ground, which we might be offended at, but they respected, because in so doing, David said, "I'm giving this water back to God as a sacrifice." And in so doing, he gained even more respect from the men. Now, the rest of the chapter is devoted to the deeds of David's great men, his mighty men, and included in those is Uriah the Hittite. Next week, we're going to conclude the story of David with the last chapter of 2 Samuel, and we're going to be reading all of 1 Kings 1 and part of chapter 2 of 1 Kings. So we'll conclude the story of David there. But before we end the study here tonight, we're going to talk about some of the lessons we learned from David's actions as he's become king again and how he conducts himself. First of all, nobody likes a sore loser. But even more so, nobody likes an arrogant winner. David shows himself to be a very humble and gracious winner. With the house of Benjamin leading the way and David accepting a man from Benjamin to be his commander of his army, especially a man who had led the other army against him before, David shows by his humble spirit that he's not holding grudges and ill will, and his actions are going to go a long ways to healing a nation that had suffered division and bloodshed for many years. So be a gracious winner when you do win. Secondly, exercise the power of forgiveness, especially when you don't have to. David was in a position to take revenge over Shimei, but he chose not to. He chose to be forgiving of him and would not listen to others who told him he needed to take his revenge. Now, David does have one reservation about Shimei, and we're going to be studying that a little bit next week. But for the most part, David is showing that he has a willingness to forgive in a way that was unheard of in David's day, and it's very rare even in our day. The third lesson we learn is we need to wait and listen to both sides of every story. David thought Ziba presented the truth to him when David was fleeing from the city, but when he returned to the city, he found out that Mephibosheth's story sounded true as well. And David really did not know which way was true, which way was not. He did not, I guess, want to spend the time to find out which one was telling the truth. And so he just simply divided the land and called it quits at that. But he learned to listen to both sides. And that's something I think we can all gain from. Don't believe the first person. Don't believe just one side. Listen to both sides of every situation and every case. Number 4, we need to always learn from our mistakes. Now, sometimes learning from our mistakes doesn't mean forgiveness. It means taking a quicker and harder stance than we did before. David kind of sat back and allowed Absalom to slowly take the kingdom away from him. I think he knew what Absalom was doing. I know that he had to have been told what Absalom was doing, but he decided to just let it go and hope for the best. Well, after what happened with Absalom and the nation being plunged into civil war, when Sheba begins to revolt, David realized he cannot sit by and just let it go. He knows that it can turn out worse, so he acts very quickly. And sometimes you and I learn from our past situations, and we just have to sometimes practice tough love. Sometimes we just have to be hard. Number 5, sometimes you and I suffer from the actions of someone before us. And that's what happened with David. They had a famine in the land in the days of David the king, long after Saul had died, but the famine was due to what Saul had done. And it was up to David to make it right. Sometimes you and I are going to have to be the ones to make things right when someone else has done wrong. But we need to be humble about it. We need to submit to doing what's right. And I think that when we do that, God will bless us, as he did David. And one last thing to think about is that when you and I sit back and look at where we are, we need to show gratitude toward those who helped to get us where we are, for those who helped to make us what we are. We need to not only think about that, we need to let them know in a way that they know we are appreciative of their actions. We need to give them the praise that they deserve, the praise that they have earned, because it's not always just about us. Now that completes this lesson. I have one little thing to add, and kind of in the way of a devotional message. The story's kind of humorous, and the story, I think, also has an application for us as well. There's a story of an army war game, and during the war game, a commanding officer's jeep got stuck in the mud. He saw some men lounging around, and he asked them to help get the jeep unstuck. They said, "Sorry, sir, we've been classified as dead, and the umpire said we could not contribute in any way." The commanding officer turned to his driver and he said this, "Go drag a couple of these dead bodies over here and throw them under the wheels to give us some traction." Now, I think the men decided that they would go ahead and contribute regardless. But you know, war games are not the only time when you can see a lot of dead bodies not walking or not working around. We live in a world of the living dead. But the Apostle Paul said that in Ephesians chapter 2, 1 and part of verse 2, you he made alive. You who were dead in trespasses and sins in which you once walked according to the course of this world. Did you notice that we once were dead, but he's made us alive? And we need to act like we are alive. During the COVID-19 crisis, most churches in our country have suspended having services. We are one of those. Some of them are going back to services very soon. Next Sunday, we're going to wait a little longer. We want to be very, very careful, and we want to be measured in our actions. But it would be very easy for Christians in all these churches that are not meeting to simply act like we've been declared dead. We can't do anything right now. That's not the case. There's a lot of work to do. There are a lot of people who still need Jesus. There's a lot that we can still be learning and practicing as Christians. Jesus said in John chapter 9, "I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work." He's talking about death there. And when he talks about that, he's telling all of us, as long as you're alive, there are works of God you need to be doing. And you need to do it while you can. That's the case with us. We hope to start meeting on May the 17th, but there's a lot of work you and I can do in the world before then. There are a lot of people we can reach. There are a lot of scriptures we can read and study, a lot of prayers we can offer up on behalf of others, our nation's leaders, our neighbors, those who are on the front lines fighting the disease and helping people. Don't risk being thrown under the wheels so that traction can be gotten. Anyway, have a great few days before we meet again, and I hope that you will be able to watch the sermon that's coming up on May the 3rd. God bless you, and we will see you later.